Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk about how much of Gerald Gardner as an individual there actually is in Gardnerian Wicca. Uh, this sounds like a silly question at first because Gardnerian Wicca is named after Gerald Gardner, and it is by definition the Wicca that Gardner introduced to the world. So it seems like, of course, there's a lot of Gerald Gardner in Gardnerian Wicca. His fingerprints are all over it. But I don't actually think that's true. And I just want to talk a little bit today about why that's the case and why I think that way. Before we start talking about that, it is important to highlight that this is a subject on which there is room for reasonable disagreement. So I am of the opinion that there's not a lot of Gerald Gardner's individual personality or his idiosyncrasies present in the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca. There are other people who are very well informed and very thoughtful who feel differently than I do. That's also legitimate. There is room for multiple perspectives on this. And this is a situation where we have decent historical information, but we don't have enough information to put this subject to rest entirely. So there is sort of a matter of, like, take the information that's available to you and make the best judgment that you can with it, and different people will make different judgments, and that's okay. First, a little bit about the origins of Gardnerian Wicca, just to kind of situate us all on the same page. Wicca is not an ancient religion. It originates in the 20th century. The best evidence that we currently have suggests that there was such a thing as the New Forest Coven, that Gardner claimed had initiated him into a witch cult. And the evidence that we have suggests that there was a group of people who came together in the late 20s, early 30s, who felt that they had known each other as witches in a past life, and who began experimenting with magic, religion, and ritual in order to try to reconstruct or recreate something of the witchcraft that they imagined they had practiced together in a previous life. And out of this experimentation, the sort of skeleton of the thing that would later become Wicca was born. And then these people met Gerald Gardner, they liked him, they clicked with him, they inducted him into this version of the witch cult, and then later on, when Gardner went public in the 50s, Gardner brought the witch cult to the wider world. We also know that the witch cult that Gardner presented to the world was not identical to whatever it was that he was doing with the New Forest Coven. We know that there were changes that happened between point A and point B. Part of why we know this is because of Doreen Valiente. So in her book, The Rebirth of Witchcraft, Valiente talks about when she was initiated by Gardner and when she first started working with him, having noticed lots of historical influences on Gardner's works. So noticing the presence of the Golden Bough and the White Goddess, Freemasonry, Aleister Crowley, the Grimoire tradition, Charles Godfrey Leland, right? Lots of other influences that seemed to be present in the ritual framework or the theology of the Wicca that Gardner had presented. And she writes that when she confronted Gardner on it, he said, quote, that the rituals he had received from the old coven were very fragmentary, and that in order to make them workable, he had been compelled to supplement them with other material. And so Gardner, whatever he did or did not get from the New Forest Coven, and there are still people who disagree with the claim that there even was a New Forest Coven. Personally, I feel pretty convinced by that evidence, but there are other people who really do think that, like, Gerald Gardner as an individual made it all up. But whether there was or wasn't a New Forest Coven, whatever Gardner may have gotten from them, we know that he changed it between when he was working with them and when he went public in the 1950s, because he admitted as much to Doreen Valiente. Now the question is, what did those changes look like, and how much of them come from Gardner as an individual? And by that, what I mean is, are these changes that come because Gardner was feeling that something was fragmentary, and so he sort of brought in something from the outside to fill in the gaps? Or are these creative changes where Gerald Gardner himself said, I am going to create something new. that feels specifically like it came from me as an individual. I am of the opinion that most of what we see in Gardner's sort of ritual additions and his embellishments and sort of the kind of Wicca that he introduces to the world in the 50s, most of that does not feel to me like it really specifically belongs to Gerald Gardner as an individual. And what I mean by that is that those are changes or additions or, sources brought in that could have come in from anyone, and we do not need to know about Gerald Gardner specifically. We don't need to know like biographical details about his life or about his personality to understand those influences or why they came into the craft. The White Goddess is, I think, a great example, right? The White Goddess is a dreadful book, but in the 50s, it was this kind of revelatory vision of what a, pagan goddess worshipping cult might look like and how much that might connect to the seasons. And that is a source that was popular at the time and that anyone in Gerald Gardner's position might have reached for if they were trying to supplement what they believed to be ancient but fragmentary witchcraft rituals. As opposed to if there were something that Gerald had written himself or something that Gerald had brought in because it was like his favorite book as a child, or because it was particularly related to like Gerald's individual interests. And I don't see a lot of that in the Gardnerian tradition. What I see when I look at the Gardnerian tradition and when I look at the sort of external sources that shaped the tradition, I see things that were very much in the zeitgeist of magic and of discussions about paganism at the time. And I see things that anyone in a similar position might reasonably have reached for. And the reason that's significant to me is that I think we don't actually need to understand Gerald as a person terribly well in order to understand the Gardnerian tradition of Wicca. Now, historically, it may be valuable to understand Gerald as a person, right? Like, reading Gerald's biography can provide some interesting context. It can also explain some of the interpersonal relations that happened in the 50s and the early 60s between Gerald Gardner and other people. But I don't think that we need to know about who Gerald was and like the things that he liked and the things that he thought in order to understand Wicca. I really think that Wicca kind of stands on its own, and that even with things that Gerald may have added into Wicca from when he was with the New Forest Coven to when he goes public in the 50s, I think that none of those things really live or die upon an understanding of Gerald Gardner as a person. I think we can understand them perfectly well without resorting to biographical information about Gardner himself. And part of this we do also see in Gardner's published writings. There are a lot of points where he says something to the effect of, "The witches do this and they won't tell me why." Or they don't know why. They've forgotten why. They do X, Y, and Z. They say it's really important, but they will not tell me why they do it. And so I think there are a lot of things in Wicca, even in the Wicca that Gardner publicly introduces to the world, that Gardner himself didn't understand and didn't have a lot of influence on. And I think that we sometimes forget that or fail to credit that. This is a point that Philip Heselton and Christina Oakley Harrington both make really eloquently. And the heart of this point is, for someone who is credited as the founder of a religion, Gerald Gardner does an astonishing amount of saying, "They do this and I have no idea what it is, where it comes from, or why it means." I have no idea what it is, where it comes from, or what it means, right? Gerald does a lot of saying, like, this is a thing that the witches did, and they don't have an explanation to provide to me. That doesn't feel, and again, this is an argument made by Heselton and Oakley Harrington. This is not my original argument, but it's an argument I buy. That doesn't feel like the tone of someone who is creating everything whole cloth and imposing his own personality on it. Because generally speaking, people who are inventing everything because they like it a particular way are very excited to tell you about the particular way that they like it and the significance that it has for them. And what we see in Gerald's published writings is a lot of this is the thing that I've been told is a part of how witchcraft is done, but I don't really understand what its significance might be. So I think there's a lot in Wicca, that just doesn't necessarily come from Gerald, right? I think there is a good deal more that comes from the New Forest Coven than we credited the Coven with for a long time. The sort of trajectory of narratives about Wiccan history is that up until the 90s, Wiccans, for the most part, had a narrative that Wicca was ancient. There were people who dissented, but that was the dominant narrative. And then in 99, Ronald Hutton publishes The Triumph of the Moon, at which point there's really compelling historical evidence that suggests that Wicca is not ancient and that it is a product of Romanticism and particular magical and religious currents of a time. And after the publication of The Triumph of the Moon, there was a really strong current of Gerald Gardner as an individual made it all up. And I think what we're seeing right now, certainly the camp that I fall in, the camp that a couple of other people I know of fall into, and the camp that I think is where the scholarship is sort of swinging toward, is that Wicca is not ancient, but that there was a group that did initiate Gerald Gardner, and that group came together and was, rather than one person saying, I am going to create a religion, that group was working collaboratively and experimentally to try to create or recreate something like what they imagined witchcraft might have been like in the past, because they sincerely believed that they had been doing witchcraft in the past, in previous incarnations. And that Wicca was born not out of sort of one man coming along and saying, I'm going to make a religion, but rather out of a group of people who were collaboratively experimenting to try to recreate something that they felt had been lost. And that Gerald comes in relatively late in that process and does add to it and does embellish it, but adds to it and embellishes it, I think, largely from published sources that were available and popular at the time, and that anyone else who was looking to supplement a pagan witchcraft religion could also have reached for. And that the real heart of what Wicca is was kind of there before Gerald and didn't depend on Gerald. That's the stance that I tend to have. Again, I just want to emphasize there is room for disagreement here. So I don't want to be dogmatic. I'm sharing my perspective based on arguments I have heard from other people that have really won me over, and based on my own familiarity with not just the tradition, but then also the sources, things like the White Goddess, things like the works of Aleister Crowley, that we see influencing the early days of Wicca. Because I think that really and truly, it is not a big leap. If you are someone practicing magic in the 20th century and you're doing a pagan religious cult, it is not a big leap for you to want to look at things like the works of Aleister Crowley and Dion Fortune, for you to be interested in the Golden Bough. Anyone would have done that. And I don't think a lot of it really depends on Gardner as a specific individual personality. And part of why that matters is, when I'm having conversations with other Gardnerians, a lot of the time I'll talk about, this thing that we do in ritual or that I've seen someone else do in ritual, yada, 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 is really interesting to me, and I'm exploring sort of where that comes from and what that feels like to me. And sometimes people will say something like, oh, well, I always just thought that came from, the time that Gardner spent living in Malaysia, or whatever else. And I'm always a little taken aback by those perspectives. Not because they're bad, but just because it's a very different perspective than my own, where when I am looking to understand a thing that we do in Wicca, either historically, where it comes from, what the source is, or what its significance might be, which the idea of meaning is stupid and nonsensical in a mystery cult anyway, but if I'm trying to explore what it might mean for me in my experiences, I'm never going to look to Gerald Gardner as an individual for those answers. I'm never going to think, oh, well, I should try to figure out when in Gerald Gardner's life he got interested in this thing. Because I really don't think of Gardnerian Wicca in terms of Gerald Gardner. I think of it in terms of the tradition that predated him, not by a lot, but that did predate him, at least that I think predated him, that was developed collaboratively and experimentally, and that he did supplement, but that he supplemented with well-known and popular sources on paganism, witchcraft, and magic. So, yeah, I don't know. It's a thing that informs the way that I approach those conversations and the way that other people approach those conversations. And I just wanted to kind of sit down and talk to a camera about it. Yeah, I think that's all I have for today. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here. I hope you enjoyed. I will talk to you sometime soon. Bye.